And firstly, thanks to the Australian Institute for inviting me to give this keynote speech today or talk at the Climate Integrity Summit. I'm very sorry and frankly not a little bit sad that I can't be in Canberra in person. It's due to events beyond my control, unfortunately. But I'm calling in today from Whadjuk Noongar country in Perth, Western Australia. And I'm really hoping that this Zoom call goes well. Now look, the timing of this Climate Integrity Summit could not be better. Alongside concerns both here and internationally about inadequate levels of mitigation ambition on climate action, there are increasing concerns about the integrity of net zero targets, and in particular the use of offsets instead of real action to cut emissions. Now I'm going to talk initially about the international context, some science, and then drill a bit into the Australian situation, which as it happens is emerging as central to the issue of integrity in action on climate change. There's no doubt that Australia's positioning on climate change, both politically and substantively, has dramatically improved since the election of the Albanese government last May. The strengthened 2030 target, climate legislation, and so on have improved Australia's international standing on climate action, which prior to that was very, very low. The context, of course, is that over the last decade, Australia has developed a very bad reputation internationally for both low ambition and for manipulating emission accounting systems. This reputation really started with the so-called Australia clause inserted at the very last minute in the 1997 Kyoto Protocol negotiations, which almost uniquely gave Australia a large benefit from historically high deforestation in 1990. More recently, Australia was called out publicly for its attempt to use carryover Kyoto credits to meet its already weak Paris targets at Madrid in 2019. In other words, Australia over a period of time had developed a reputation for questionable integrity, one which the Albanese government has well and truly begun to put behind us. However, as I will outline in this talk, the government's proposed approach to offsetting under the safeguard mechanism risks winding this situation backwards. Now, the paramount need for integrity in emission policies and action is driven very much by the urgency of meeting the Paris Agreement's 1.5 degree limit. The 1.5 degree limit is the guardrail governments agreed under the Paris Agreement in 2015. Australia is one of the supporters of this limit in Paris. The importance of this limit has been reinforced multiple times at high-level meetings and in IPCC reports. To limit warming to 1.5 degrees, I think everyone in this room knows that the world has to make deep and real cuts in emissions of at least 50% by 2030 and reach net zero by around 2050. But even at 1.5 degrees global average warming, the world and Australia will see serious climate impacts like we haven't witnessed before. It is by no means clear that our coral reefs, including the Great Barrier Reef or Ningaloo on the west coast, would survive a 1.5 degree hotter world. Frankly, we also can't say for certain if several of our most vulnerable land-based ecosystems will survive even this level of warming intact. Globally, we're now at 1.1 degrees warming, and we're already seeing really serious impacts play out. Catastrophic floods in Pakistan, wildfires raging across Siberia in the US, rising seas and king tides and cyclones hitting small island states, and unprecedented heat waves and drought in China, Europe, and parts of Africa. Closer to home, the warming to date is higher than the global average at about 1.4 degrees. This level of warming, we've seen really extreme wildfires and floods, from which many people, communities and ecosystems have yet to recover. And right now, our mates across the Tasman and the North Island of New Zealand are really suffering from a very large extreme event that must have been made worse by global warming. Now, Australia needs to play its part both politically and substantively in the global effort to halve emissions by 2030 because we have real skin in this game. Any policies that we adopt that essentially enable ongoing and increased fossil fuel production and export will work against this objective. Now, before diving into the issue of offsets in Australia, I wanted to go through a few key issues. It's very important for people to understand that there's a very, very long hangover from fossil fuel emissions today. Fossil fuel emissions linger in the atmosphere for a very long time. Around 40% of what we emit today will still be in the air in 100 years' time. 20 to 25% will remain for 1,000 years and up to 20% for 10,000 years. In Australia, we emit about 20 tonnes of CO2 from burning fossil fuels per person each year. This doesn't even account for our international emissions from fossil fuel exports, which would make this much higher. So that means in about 100 years, about 8 tonnes of each person's annual emissions of 20 tonnes will be in the atmosphere. 1,000 years, 5 tonnes will remain, and in 10,000 years, up to 4 tonnes. This is a really critical understanding everyone needs to have when we start to think about how we reduce emissions, how fast, and the role of offsets. Now, I'm going to start drilling into offsets, and there's some very big issues with land-based offsets. They're generic. There was even a whole IPCC report on it back in 2000. Offsets generated from activities in the land sector, however, are very popular in Australia. Yet it's well known that land-based offsets are reversible and particularly susceptible to integrity issues, specifically whether the emission reductions claimed are genuine, additional, and permanent. Compared to the thousands of years that fossil fuel CO2 emissions stay in the atmosphere, land-based carbon offsets do not and cannot guarantee sequestration of carbon on such timescales. Another difficult issue is that land has a limited ability to take up carbon. These limits are ultimately determined by the climate, local soil and topographic considerations, and by how depleted the land is from previous use or abuse. The ability of the land to store and sequester carbon also appears likely to be reduced as a consequence of climate change. This is particularly true in Australia. Worsening drought and extreme fire conditions are already affecting forests in Australia and are likely to reduce the ability of our forests and soils to take up, store, and to hold carbon in the long term. Hotter and drier Australian landscapes will simply absorb less carbon in trees and soil and at the same time jeopardize the carbon stores that they are already holding. Now, a critical issue with carbon offsets, often overlooked in Australia, is the need to ensure permanence over a long period of time. Carbon offsets need to be permanent to truly offset the climate effects of a fossil CO2 emission. In Australia, carbon offset projects need to guarantee permanence of emissions for just 25 or at most 100 years. There is no requirement for carbon to be stored any longer than this. There is also no requirement to replace carbon from projects lost after this permanence, so-called permanence period. If carbon is ultimately lost after a project's legal permanence period ends in Australia, as is likely over longer time frames, the atmospheric CO2 concentration will be higher than if the offset scheme had never existed. So, even if an offset scheme is fully additional and perfectly offsets fossil CO2 emissions over the 25 or 100 years required in Australia, in the long run, it could likely do more harm than good from a climate protection perspective. Another issue is that offsets need to be additional to what would otherwise have happened to have any benefit. Now, it turns out that establishing whether emission reductions from land sector offset projects are additional to what would otherwise have happened has proven to be very difficult and problematic. Without real additionality, even if all other aspects of an offsetting scheme are perfect, the system could lead to more CO2 being emitted than would otherwise have been the case. Now, emission reductions used to generate offsets, you need to be genuine. Independent experts have shown in Australia that several methods for generating offsets often don't result in genuine emission reductions at the levels claimed, or in some cases at all. Avoided deforestation and human-induced regeneration are two of the most popular methods in Australia, but have been singled out as inadequate in independent assessments. The complexity and resource intensity of measurement approaches and methods in Australia for some of the land sector offset methods is also a significant and potential and actual barrier to ensuring genuineness of emission reductions. Now, of course, land-based offsets are part of a larger collection of actions called nature-based solutions. What is really important to understand is that nature-based solutions are a complement to emissions reductions at source, not a replacement. The storage of carbon in ecosystems, both natural and managed, is now increasingly termed nature-based solutions. Maintaining the storage of carbon in ecosystems and soils is widely recognized as important, if not critical, to efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. Measures to achieve this, including stopping deforestation, land clearance, reducing degradation of ecosystems, restoring ecosystems, building up soils in agriculture and pastoral areas, and a range of other activities, all of which are good and can be good for biodiversity and sustainability. What appears to be not well understood is that this needs to be done in addition to emission reductions at source, not as an alternative. Now, the offset-based system in Australia treats this as an alternative to emission reductions. If you save a tonne of CO2 emissions in the land sector, then you can go ahead and emit an extra tonne in the fossil fuel sector. Now, scientists have been looking at the whole role of nature-based solutions and have developed some very useful guides to policymakers to help ensure that nature-based solutions provide multiple benefits to biodiversity, Indigenous people, and local communities. Paramount amongst these, from a climate perspective, is that nature-based solutions are not a substitute for the rapid phase-out of fossil fuels. The proposed safeguard mechanism, allowing unlimited offsets from the land sector, essentially throws out this principle, contradicting the objective of a rapid phase-out of fossil fuels and thereby undermining the climate benefits of action in this sector and risk making global warming simply worse. Now, the real-world experience of offsets is not great. The real-world experience has shown a tendency of offset projects to create negative outcomes for food, water security, ecosystem biodiversity, and the well-being of traditional landowners. Four Corners' expose on Monday of serious issues with a variety of offset projects in Papua New Guinea is just an illustration of this more general problem. Many, if not most, developing countries do not have the resources or the capacity to regulate and enforce offset project integrity. But even developed countries struggle. In California, for example, about 30 million tons of CO2 offsets worth about 400 million US were found not to represent genuine emission reductions. Also in California, a buffer mechanism was established to ensure against reversals due to wildfires with a view to guaranteeing permanence over at least 100 years. Unfortunately, and you've all seen the wildfires in California, these wildfires have already depleted nearly 1/5 of the total buffer pool in less than 10 years. This is equivalent to 95% of the program-wide buffer pool contribution intended to manage all fire risks in these areas for 100 years. In other words, it's simply not working. Now, there is rising international concern over offsets. The size of the voluntary carbon markets based around offsets has risen markedly in recent years. In 2020, we saw a 30% growth in the number of so-called VCM credits, voluntary carbon market credits issues. Several international organizations have attempted to produce criteria to ensure high quality, high integrity offsets that deal with the fundamental shortcomings, impermanence, non-additionality, genuineness, but real-world experience shows it's very difficult. In addition to the issues I mentioned previously, there are significant potential issues with double counting for international projects if emission reductions counted in countries' Paris Agreement plans, their nationally determined contributions are also used for corporate targets, which, unless controlled, will happen. Now, international concern has escalated in recent years as more and more corporates, notably from the fossil fuel sector, attempt to use voluntary carbon market offsets to create carbon neutral products, such as carbon neutral liquefied natural gas shipments, in order to avoid serious and real emission reduction action. Now, spurred by these concerns, the UN Secretary General established the high-level expert group on the net zero emission commitments of non-state entities, a bit of a mouthful, acronym is HLEG, which might be even worse, in March 2022. It asked us on that group to report to him by November last year on a range of matters, including on the role of offsets. Now, the group's report on net zero targets was delivered in November 2022 and recommends that offsets not be used to meet a company's 1.5 degree aligned targets for 2030 and beyond. In other words, we found that offsets should not be counted towards a company's interim emission reduction goals, and instead companies should focus on making real emission reductions. From another direction, the International Standards Organization worked over the last year or so and has developed and set new net zero guideline, which states that effectively that offsets should only be used where there are no viable alternatives and should not be used for 2030 targets. There's also strong and growing opposition to use of offsets, particularly within climate and environment movements and the not-for-profit sector. The Climate Action Network International is a coalition of over 1,900 civil society organisations from 130 countries. It includes the Climate Action Network in Australia. And it has been engaged in the international climate processes since it began, and it's very well respected. Last year, Cannes published its strong opposition to offsets. A recent sweeping investigation by media into the world's leading carbon offset certifier found serious concerns that potentially 90% or more of claimed rainforest credits may not represent genuine emission reductions. The Four Corners investigation into offset projects found serious issues and anomalies in that direction as well, which appear to mirror those problems found in all other parts of the world where this is done. Now, in Australia, the proposed safeguard mechanism reforms would allow unlimited offset use, while independent concerns over the integrity of the offset methods used and the system of operation do not seem to have been adequately addressed. The government-sponsored Chubb review into offset schemes found that these were essentially sound, despite extensive and substantive criticisms from independent experts, including the former chair of the offset scheme regulatory body. These criticisms were mostly ignored, leading many experts to question the Chubb review's findings. The proposed policy of allowing unlimited offsets under the safeguard mechanism is at grave risk of enabling ongoing fossil fuel production and growth. The unfettered use of offsets under the safeguard mechanism will likely allow real emission increases, as opposed to reductions, from the totality of the facilities covered by the mechanism. Under the present proposals, new fossil fuel facilities with no limitations on the use of offsets will be able to bring significant new emissions into the scheme and force the cost of their emission burden onto other industries. All this would have adverse implications, not just for Australia's total emissions, but also globally. As an example, one Australian carbon credit unit tonne used to offset 1 tonne of emissions from the LNG production process in Australia leads to about 8.4 tonnes of CO2 equivalent emissions in total life cycle emissions globally. That's a multiplier of 8.4 times. For coal mining, 1 ACCU tonne used to offset 1 tonne of emissions from coal mining would lead to 58 to 67 tonnes for an average mine in Australia, equivalent to total life cycle emissions globally. That's a very big multiplier. Now, just turning to wrap up a bit. In the 9 months or so since the Albanese government came to power, it has made really substantial strides and improved Australia's positioning and climate policy stance on climate change. The adoption of a 43% reduction target from 2005 levels by 2030 is a major improvement on the previous government's 26 to 28% goal, although it's well known that the 43% target falls significantly short of the reductions needed to be consistent with Australia playing its full part in global efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. The adoption of climate legislation to consolidate this target strengthens the legal basis for action. The government has made great strides ratcheting up power sector investments as it works towards an 82% renewable power system by 2030. 82% is quite close to the level needed to be on a 1.5 degree pathway for this sector. However, a key element of the proposed reforms to the safeguard mechanism, which covers most of the energy-intensive facilities in Australia, allows essentially unfettered use of offsets. This raises at least 4 concerns. Firstly, by allowing unlimited use of offsets by companies to meet their emission reduction obligations, the government is very likely sanctioning a large-scale continuation and expansion in fossil fuel production and its associated emissions. Secondly, a likely result of the unlimited use of offsets is to provide a green light for new coal and gas production. This contradicts what the science is telling us and what organisations like the International Energy Agency is saying. We simply cannot afford new coal, oil, or gas production capacity if we are to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. Thirdly, because offsetting emissions leaves carbon-intensive equipment in place, companies are locked into future emissions over the equipment's lifetime. At the broad economic level, this slows and undermines Australia's transition towards being a zero carbon economy. Fourth, finally, the international community and the growing ecosystem of actors around decarbonisation, notably the finance sector, will not be fooled by offsets. There is rising international concern and indeed opposition to companies and countries using offsets to meet their obligations. This concern could translate into serious reputational risk for Australian companies and ultimately for the Australian economy. Now, we know there are already allegations of greenwashing due to corporations' use of offsets in many contexts, notably in the gas sector. It will just be a matter of time before greenwashing could become a label attached to Australia's own climate policy due to the unfettered use of offsets. Countries will not be fooled if the proposed unlimited offset scheme enables our industrial emitters to maintain or increase emissions, and Australia tries to create a smokescreen about increased fossil fuel production with this system. Now, it turns out that Kazakhstan appears to be the only other country that allows an unlimited approach to offsets. And we should also not overlook the fact that the European Union trading system, which I think one day Australia may wish to join, as part of a larger global system, has discontinued the use of international credit since 2021. Now, it's my feeling that the integrity of what Australia does at the next step is going to be the subject of great international scrutiny, not just by governments, but by banks, financial institutions, and those purchasing Australian commodities, minerals, who need to clean up greenhouse gas emissions along their entire supply chain. Companies producing lithium-ion batteries will not be very impressed that the lithium miner has offset their emissions rather than reduce them. The unfettered use of offsets to allow fossil fuel emissions to remain the same or increase could become one of the major integrity issues in climate policy and action globally. And unfortunately, it looks like Australia could be in the lead unless it changes direction on this issue. So thanks for your attention. I hope this Zoom in worked.